This was an interview recorded in October 2023, but is so timely today because it discusses big issues that we're all staring at, especially in light of the Doge and Elon Musk takeover of so many aspects of our lives. And so, yes, this is a discussion with in relation to many of the actions taken during the Biden administration, but it's so relevant more than ever today as we really think about where we can and should go, regardless of who is president or what administration we're engaging with. Very happy to welcome to today's Utopia's conversation, Sandeep Vaheesan. Sandeep is a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, someone I really deeply respect, and is the legal director at a very interesting organization that's based in Washington, D.C., called the Open Markets Institute. Sandeep leads their legal research and advocacy and has spoken widely on anti-monopoly law and how we can build a fair economy. One of the big questions of our time, and one of the big questions and themes that is influencing almost every election we see around the world, including the recent election of Donald Trump as the 47th president of the United States. Sandeep used to work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the American Antitrust Institute, and has done a lot of work looking at the statutory powers or the regulatory powers of the Federal Trade Commission, also known as the FTC, and has argued for a means by which the FTC can strengthen antitrust rules, governing corporations, and prohibit unfair competitive practices. So this is a pretty rich conversation about how corporate power, in some cases, got so large that it became very outsized, to the extent where it has reached the point where both workers and consumers in the United States, and to some extent in different parts of the world, are increasingly feeling the precarity where their wages and their income may just not be enough to make things really work. So how did that come to be? What are the laws or lack thereof that are really dealing with these issues? And how can we get to the point where we approach an economy, including a digital economy, an economy that includes digital interfaces and platforms and technologies, that is fair and equitable, that lifts all boats up? So very happy to welcome Sandeep Vaheesan to the Utopias podcast today. So, I think where I want to start is just I've seen and read your work around questions of regulating digital platforms and internet platforms. I've also seen that your work extends, like this forthcoming book, Democracy and Power, to other industries as well. And I'll start with just sort of asking you how you sort of started pursuing this path. Why does this path matter to you? And also tell us just a little bit about the Open Markets Institute, for which you serve as legal director.
Sure. So I feel very fortunate to have the job I have today. I didn't go to law school or even finish law school with any clear path or plan in mind. Things just happened to fall in place. I've been fortunate to have really good colleagues and mentors over the years, people who have supported me, encouraged me, promoted me. And, my interest in this area started about 15 years ago. And I came to antitrust and economic regulation out as someone who had majored in economics in college, who came to these things with certain assumptions I no longer hold, and realized over time, okay, I not only find this area intellectually interesting and stimulating, I believe it's fundamentally important for creating a fair and small d democratic economy. And when I started, I had no idea how I could do that. I actually spent my first 2 years out of law school working at a corporate law firm, knowing full well that I would not be there for 5-10 years, let alone make a partner. That was not my aspiration. But I also wasn't entirely sure what I could do that was in line with my personal convictions. And I feel very fortunate to have worked with the American Antitrust Institute in law school and early in my career, and had very strong supportive mentors who showed me you can actually live and practice your values and make a decent living, not going to make white shoe law firm salaries, but make a good, comfortable living for myself and my family. And I've been with the Open Markets Institute for about 5.5 years now. It's been exciting, a lot of fun. We have a really good team of lawyers, policy people, even one economist. We can talk more about economists and their intellectual clout. And we're an anti-monopoly research and advocacy organization. We do a lot of work on antitrust law, as that description would suggest, but we view our purview as much bigger than antitrust law. Good antitrust law, getting antitrust law right is important, but antitrust alone is not going to build a democratic political economy. So we also take topics like public utility regulation, consumer protection, corporate governance as integral to our work, not something that we can afford to ignore.
So, for many of you who are listening or seeing this who might be a little bit dismayed or cynical about Washington, D.C., and and perhaps the feeling like that there aren't important organizations that are working to protect consumers, working to protect businesses of all types, not just mega corporations, but actually small and medium-sized businesses, working to actually make markets competitive, trying in on every level possible, and also engaging with and bringing back to light a reality of American industry, which and history, excuse me, which is that many institutions, including the electricity industry, were public and cooperative. So, right now we are at a time, Sandeep, but I wanted to ask you about where there seems to be a lot of populist rage at the at elites who have wielded power and perhaps pulled the wool over other people's eyes, fooling consumers, making dignified work quite precarious to access, and perhaps even making it difficult to create thriving and sustainable businesses that are not mega corporations. In fact, I'm sure you have friends in the same space as I. Some of my friends in the technology industry in particular, which we know is kind of the industry that now mediates everything,
Mm-hmm.
are basically, their goal is to have their business or app or service or what have you sold to Google or Meta / Facebook or Amazon and so on.
Right.
So where are we at in terms of trying to fight the fight for a more equitable economy, and how does that connect to democracy in your mind?
Sure. So I think we're still in the very early stages of the fight. And if you look at the history of the 21st century, I think this populist upsurge really began with the financial crisis of 2008, the subsequent Great Recession, where everybody saw the federal government pull out all the stops to protect big banks, ensure that no one on Wall Street would take a hit, while also letting millions of people lose their homes due to foreclosures. So the anger, which I think is fully justified, has been channeled in many different directions, some good, some quite dangerous. You know, I would say the good would include things like, Occupy Wall Street, the two presidential campaigns of Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, the growth of progressive and left factions like the Squad, people who are quite explicitly against the neoliberal status quo and believe in fairness, believe in democracy. But then on the other side, it's undeniable that the growth of the far right is in some sense a product of the financial crisis, and in a sense, elites co-opting this energy, diverting it away from anger at Wall Street and the Fortune 500 and channeling it toward immigrants, people of color, and other minorities. And it's hard to say how things are going to shake out. I think there's certainly some encouraging things happening here in Washington. I think there's tremendous interest in reining in the power of the tech companies. We've seen some landmark antitrust suits from the federal government, but filing a complaint against Amazon is not the same thing as democratizing it or even making it somewhat more equitable. It's simply the first step toward doing that. So, to use a baseball metaphor, I think we're optimistically maybe in the first or second inning of this fight. There's a long way to go, and uh, I'm I try to remain optimistic, and I think we will win these fights, but it's a long, fraught path ahead.
Yeah, because you've actually worked in a few different domains that I think all are interesting in if you look at them and how they might intersect with one another. I mean, you've worked on with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and I'd love for you to just kind of briefly tell us all what that is and their effectiveness. You've also worked on issues of regulating monopolies, right? Which is something also done by the Federal Trade Commission in Washington, D.C., which is trying to basically regulate or rein in corporations, private power that is moving toward monopoly to a monopoly kind of status. So, if I were to kind of put all these things together, first, could you just kind of tell us just quickly, explain to us what antitrust means and what a free market looks like compared to something that's too big and basically usurping power, and also tell us a little bit about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau here in the U.S.
Sure. So antitrust law governs the practices of businesses. How can they compete? How can they cooperate? How can they grow? So it regulates things such as predatory pricing, where companies sell their goods or services below the cost of production, basically intentionally taking a loss as a means of driving out rivals. It regulates mergers. It regulates collusion. So it's really one of the fundamental rules of market governance. There are really sets of rules of market governance. What can businesses do? What can't they do? And done right, antitrust law channels business strategy towards things like good customer service, fair treatment of workers, investment in better production techniques, investment in research and development. So done right, it can actually create a more prosperous and equitable society. Unfortunately, that's not the world we've been living in for more than 40 years now. Antitrust has been reconfigured fundamentally, and this has mostly been done by the courts, not by Congress. That's something we can talk about later on, in a way that businesses really have carte blanche to compete uh, by hook or crook, whether it's breaking the law on a large scale, deliberately losing money to drive out rivals. Both those things I just described would apply to a firm like Uber. So antitrust law has been sort of contributing to the deepening inequalities and injustices in American society. I think we at the Open Markets Institute view our work as sort of reclaiming antitrust as a progressive tool. It's been a tool for concentration, a tool for plutocracy since the late 1970s. Let's make it a tool for democracy and justice again. Your second question was about the CFPB. So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was formed after the 2008 financial crisis. It was part of this big financial reform law passed by Congress in 2010 called the Dodd-Frank Act. The agency itself was a brainchild of Senator Elizabeth Warren, who was then a professor at Harvard. And the reason it was created was the 2008 crisis happened in large part because of predatory mortgage lending. So people were tricked into taking out mortgages they couldn't afford. They thought they were getting a very attractive interest rate or a very attractive monthly payment, and then quickly realized, okay, what we thought we were getting was actually a raw deal. That teaser rate expired after 6 months or a year, and then people had mortgages that they could no longer afford, which meant, at a minimum, deep financial distress, and in many cases, foreclosure, people losing their houses. And one reason this happened was before the crisis, we had about a dozen, maybe as many as 18 federal regulators that were charged with protecting consumers in credit markets. So the Federal Reserve had some responsibility, the Federal Trade Commission had some responsibility, Housing and Urban Development had some responsibility. But for all these agencies, consumer protection in finance was sort of a secondary mission. When people think about the Federal Reserve, they don't think about consumer protection. And this was often forgotten by these regulators. They did it, or they did it at best very half-heartedly, or didn't do it at all. And so after the crisis, people led by Senator Warren realized, okay, we need to consolidate this regulatory function in one agency, and this one agency would be responsible for nothing else. It wouldn't be setting interest rates. It wouldn't be regulating banks. It wouldn't be regulating product safety. It would just be focused on protecting consumers in market for mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, and it would do nothing else. And so this agency was a product of the 2008 crisis, and was created, officially opened its doors in July of 2011. So it's still a fairly young agency, and by Washington standards, a small agency. I think at present it has maybe 1,200 or 1,300 people. In DC, like the Department of Agriculture employs tens of thousands of people. The Department of Defense, obviously, even bigger. So the CFPB is a relatively small fish in the ocean of Washington, D.C. bureaucracies, but it's done a lot of good work. It's fixed the mortgage market. It has reined in unfair practices in credit cards. I was at the agency not at the beginning, but from 2015 through 2018. And when I was there, I was involved in the writing of a rule regulating payday and title loans. So these are loans taken out by people who are in financial distress, who need money. Think about a typical working class person or poor person. Their income is low and volatile. They have expenses, often unexpected expenses, just like all of us, but they don't necessarily have cushion of savings. They don't have $20,000 on their credit card. They have to find money to pay the utility bill or pay for a car repair. And so they often turn to things like payday loans that are very high interest, short-term loans. And research has found that once you take out a payday loan, you're likely to be stuck. You're going to roll it over for a long period of time because you just don't have the financial wherewithal to pay it off. And so the agency tried to regulate these loans, restrict the issuance of these loans, prevented people from getting loans that they couldn't afford to pay, simply on account of their desperation. The rule has been tied up in litigation. The Supreme Court actually heard a case about the rule this week. The case itself concerned the constitutionality of the CFPB, but the cause of this litigation was the CFPB regulated payday and title lenders. They were not happy about it, and so they took the CFPB to court and really threw the sort of legal kitchen sink against the agency, not only arguing that the agency couldn't regulate them, but that the agency's basic setup was unconstitutional.
Wow, that's pretty frustrating to even hear about. When I had a chance to briefly interview Senator Elizabeth Warren when I wrote my last book. I mean, I like 3 minute, 5 minute interview kind of thing, and she told me the story, right, in a very sort of politician like way, but I mean that with respect in this particular case about her own childhood and her father's death, and how when her mother ended up taking a minimum wage job at Sears. Everyone remember Sears? And she said that was sufficient to take care of a mortgage, to take care of healthcare costs for her entire family, like all of her siblings. I think she's from a fairly big family, and to put everybody through college. And now we're at a point where we see the youngest generations, Z and younger, being the first generations to make less than their parents, even if you control for inflation. Yet we also see costs continuing to go up and up and up. And also even on a macroeconomic level, both domestically and globally, astonishing statistics. 3 people apparently with about equivalent wealth to 50% of the United States population, which is, I don't know, about 160 plus million or so. And globally, 8 people with equivalent wealth to half the world's population, the planet's population, which is around 4 billion. So I don't believe markets, and at least free markets, got us here. And I'm not really sure how we got here on a global and even on a domestic level. So I guess I want to ask you what you think are the forces, and I think you've alluded to this already. What are the forces that led to such a extractive, unequal global economy and even domestic economy? And what do we do about it?
Yeah, so our present predicament is not was not inevitable. It was the product of politics and policy. And it really began in the late 1970s. People often talk today about the post-war era, the 30 glorious years in France, and the United States had its own equivalent of broadly based economic growth, the creation of a large middle class. Obviously, this was exclusionary system. People of color were not integrated into the economic mainstream. Actually, affirmatively pushed out of the mainstream by Jim Crow in the South, and then de facto segregation everywhere else in the United States. So, shouldn't be idealizing the pre 1970s system, but in many ways, it was egalitarian compared to what we had, at least for white Americans. And if you look at the demands of the civil rights movement in the 60s, it was basically make the New Deal universal, make uh, the American equivalent of social democracy available to everyone, not just the stereotypical white male hard hat. Should be available to everyone, people of color, women. And that whole system starting in the 70s, it didn't happen overnight, but big business interests and the wealthy sort of initiated this counter revolution against the post-war system. They didn't like if you're a big business executive, you operated under fairly tight regulatory restrictions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. You didn't have the prerogatives you thought you were entitled to as the executive of a large company. Similarly, very wealthy people paid much higher taxes. They didn't have easy opportunities for making, collecting large dividend checks or selling companies and receiving $1 billion from the purchaser. So opportunities for getting fabulously rich and wielding sort of corporate prerogatives were restricted. Obviously, there were very wealthy people in the United States in the 50s and 60s, but nothing like today. Uh, and if you read the history of the post-war era, the New Deal never vanquished the elite. They were contained for a period, but they were really biding their time. They were looking to overthrow the system and bring back what they thought was their rightful place, the system that had existed before the 1930s, where wealthy wielded outsized economic and political power, big business really called the shots. And they took advantage of the crisis of the 70s, the oil crisis of 73, stagflation, to launch a full frontal assault on the New Deal and say the system is not working, not just for us, but for everyone. Prices are going up, wages are stagnating. The United States seem to be falling behind, Japan and West Germany and other industrialized countries. And so they use this crisis, or really crises, to overthrow the New Deal system and bring back something that approximated what existed before. So much greater corporate autonomy, much weaker labor unions. So in the 1950s, about 1 in 3 American private sector workers was unionized. Obviously, there were huge regional variations in that. Heavy industry in the upper Midwest and Northeast was unionized. Industry in the Southeast was generally not unionized. But at an aggregate level, about 1 in 3 workers was in a union. And that's been in decline since the 1970s because of both weakening of labor law, which was never all that strong in the United States, paired with a political assault on labor unions. I think most famously exemplified by Ronald Reagan's firing of the air traffic controllers in 1981. And I think that really signaled to employers that they could crack down on their unions, they could bust their unions, they could be union free again. And so I think that there have been a number of important contributing factors to the awesome inequality we live with, both domestically but around the world. We see similar trends everywhere. The the challenge of the post-war era was by no means confined to the United States. The forms and the specific strategies and tactics were different here than in France, than in Germany, than in India. But at a broad level, you can see strong parallels. I think an important and underrated part of that was overthrowing the antitrust system that existed between the late 1930s and the late 1970s, where it was hard for companies to do mergers and acquisitions. It was hard for them to do predatory pricing. And for a variety of reasons, I think most notably the right wing takeover of the Supreme Court, that all started changing in the 70s and really accelerated in the 1980s under Reagan. And the idea was, if we want a prosperous society, we need to let big businesses do what they want to do. We need to restore corporate autonomy. And I think an important part of creating a more equitable society will be fixing antitrust law along with labor law, et cetera.
Absolutely, absolutely. So now one thing I was noting during the pandemic, right, was there was no longer seemingly a correlation between stock market valuations and gross domestic product, which certain. And what I'm getting at here is that some of the most highly valuated companies, and some of them are so-called technology companies, but really, think of an Uber, for example. Is that a technology company or the biggest taxi company in the history of the world?
Right.
I noticed that their valuation was not necessarily always tied so tightly to profitability. Amazon was an unprofitable company for much of its history in its earlier stages.
Right.
Remember everybody when they used to sell just books online? I don't know if anyone remembers that who's
I remember
listening
those
or
days.
viewing this. And so I wonder, some of the economists I've spoken to, very progressive ones, like Yanis Varoufakis, from the former Greek minister of
Mm-hmm.
economics, who's connected to the Sanders movement, the progressive movement, calls it a zombification of capitalism. I mean, that's a term he uses. He says that no longer are even big businesses always necessarily tied to profitability, let alone, of course, hiring people at giving, providing secure work rather than gigification of work, right? Like drive for Uber, do a little bit this, that, and the other, where you can't unionize and you don't get benefits and healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I have a number of former students who are in student debt, and debt. The word debt is in the word indebted, which is a relationship of power, being indebted to another, who are driving for Uber with UCLA degrees. And this is something I've talked with some of my former students about before. So just those kind of stringing those different things together um, is what clearly what we're seeing is not a sort of free market kind of dynamic, but are we actually seeing something that's sort of a kind of a perverse stepchild or a Frankenstein of capitalism itself right now, especially with the ways data is being sort of speculated upon to generate sort of zombie economies? And what does that mean for workers and kind of everybody else on the planet?
Yes, I think the term free market, apart from often being a term of propaganda used by the right, uh, is fundamentally misleading. Every marketplace has rules on, what firms can do, how they can compete, how they can grow. And I think the actual debate we are having, or we should be having, is, what are market rules that work for everyone in our capacities as consumers, small business proprietors, workers, and citizens of what should be a small democratic country, versus rules that only work for Fortune 500 executives, Wall Street banks, private equity funds. So I think the real debate is about the content of marketplace rules rather than free market versus regulated market. And the system we have right now is very attractive if you're a venture capitalist, or if you're the sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia, or if you're the CEO of Amazon. Uh, the rules really encourage, these zombie business models that you described. according to the neoclassical account of the stock market, stock prices should reflect, discounted profits over time. So if a company is going to make a lot of money 20 years from now, it might justify a very high stock market valuation, even if it's not making money or losing money right now. And so I think the basic business model, I think pioneered by Amazon, but being applied across all sectors is persuade the venture capitalists that you're going to drive out your competitors and have a monopoly in the associated profits someday. And if you can do that, I mean, you can run losses for years. I think Uber at this point has probably lost 20 or $30 billion in its existence. And the
That's right.
promise is
Just about that number. Yeah.
it's an astounding number. There are very few businesses that can afford to do that. Most businesses can't afford to lose money for a year or two. Like they'll probably be in very deep trouble. But for these privileged corporations, they can lose extraordinary sums of money and keep their financiers happy by saying, okay, profits around the corner. We vanquish the rivals. We'll raise prices. We'll reduce what we're paying our workers. Your patience is going to pay off. And for venture capitalists, they don't necessarily need that to be true in every investment. So if they fund 10 Uber-like business models, if one of them succeeds in a big way, it's worth it. And so I think this is where antitrust could be very powerful. If antitrust law, whether through Congress or the Federal Trade Commission, said you can't engage in below cost pricing, like that takes maybe the single most attractive business model for VC off the table. They have to figure out other ways of competing. Uber goes away.
Yeah, and that would be a huge, huge intervention, right? Because if you hijack and violate any possibility of competition by, capturing in the market, wiping out your competition through, price subsidization, basically dropping the prices, then you have everybody by the stranglehold. You've knocked out unions, you've knocked out any sort of kind of competitive ecosystem, and then you can deploy. You can change the prices if you want. Then you can use the data to open up, kind of new sort of ventures like Uber Eats. Consider Uber Eats in relation to Uber. It's a triangulation of the data. And keeping in mind all of that data is, I mean, at least in part, our data, meaning like people's data, our mobility data, our preference data, our taste data, and so on. So it's a really challenging situation. It's also something, I've seen firsthand. I've attended Uber strikes, even though the workers driving for Uber are not Uber workers, right? In any sort of traditional labor sense. In Uganda, there's the punchline. How do you strike against a company that's 8,000 miles away? I mean, it's sort of a rhetorical question in a sense, but it's sort of the ability to govern and influence and monetize people and places that are thousands of miles away without any accountability is part of, I think, where capitalism has shifted. Just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think cabs are an especially revealing example because the change there has been so dramatic. Previously in the United States, the cab market was regulated at the local level. So here in DC, you still have the DC Cab Commission. They would set, terms of entry. They decide, what qualifications did you need to get a license to drive a cab. They set the fares. Everyone had to charge the same fares. You'd get into a cab and there'd be a little sticker on the window telling you, like, if you're in this zone, you're going to pay this much. If it's snowing, you might pay, 20% surcharge. So there was transparency. The market was governed at the local level by an institution that was supposed to be publicly accountable. Obviously there were serious problems in the pre-Uber taxi system. There was racial discrimination. The terms of work have obviously gotten worse, but even in 2005, it was hard to make a living as a cab driver. But that control was housed at the local level. You and I could go to the cab commission meeting and say, hey, cabs are not coming to my neighborhood. And I think the reason is it's mostly people of color live here. Cab drivers, cab operators are racist. Like, please do something about this. take action to ensure that we have cab service everywhere in the city, take action to ensure that this problem of hailing while black is no longer a problem, force cabs to be non-discriminatory as they're supposed to be under the law. And Uber blew up that whole system. Uber, first said, we're not going to comply with municipal cab regulations. That's burdensome. That's thwarting innovation. And, they had a lot of boosters in both parties who are willing to say, the cab system currently does not work. It's dysfunctional. Uber's going to shake things up for the good. And so they said, we're going to start operating cabs in violation of the law. Classic, move fast, break things, ask for forgiveness, not permission. And over time, that system has not been fully destroyed, but it's been marginalized. Like I see very few licensed cabs here in DC, even in places where you would think cabs would be going. And like Uber has become the effective cab dispatcher and cab regulator around the world. And you're right. How do we regulate Uber? How do we control Uber? We can complain about Uber, but Uber's not public. Uber's not located here in Washington, D.C. How do you hold it to account? Whatever the flaws of the old system, there was that latent democracy in it. We could organize, we could show up at the cab commission hearings and say, this system is not working for us. Cabs only showing up in wealthy white parts of the city. Fix that. Like, there's nothing equivalent with Uber.
I mean, it's almost similar to trying to protest a surveillance drone or a military drone that might be, that's thousands of meters or feet above our heads, but we can barely even see. But we don't even know what it's capturing, and we don't know if at any point it might drop something on us. And certain, and it's also an interesting, what you just shared, Sandeep, is interesting because the industries that are displaced often by so-called platforms, technology companies like Uber, which they call themselves a technology company, who, after all, would ever criticize technology. Technology is just neutral. It's just efficient. It's just rational. I'm joking here, but what was actually displaced were worker-owned cooperatives. That's the case in many parts of the world, and that was the case here in the United States. So in Uganda, like this example I shared, many of the people that were driving for Uber used to be part of cooperatives, meaning the workers, the drivers themselves owned the cars, or they owned any profit or revenues gained were shared with the entire group. Nothing was being extracted, certainly to the level of some sort of zombie stock hedge fund portfolio, right? So I think what I want to do now is ask you a little about a very refreshing reminder, and this touches on your forthcoming book. So congratulations on that as well, called Democracy in Power. It's a great double reference to what democracy looks like when it has power, but also democracy in relation to the electricity industry. So you reminded us when I saw you speak at University of Pennsylvania of a substantial history in the United States and actually much of the world, even what I was just alluding to, where various forms of industry were owned by the people, or at least there was some sort of balanced, what we call political economy, which is the politics of economic sharing and ownership and so on. That actually this whole sort of blindly staring into the abyss and not knowing how how the very few are making money off all of us, which is sort of a status quo type of situation that creates a lot of anxiety and populist anger in the United States. That wasn't the case always in the U.S. and that's still and that isn't the case maybe in certain contexts still here and maybe in other parts of the world. So can you speak to that and specifically also your book?
Sure. So one great thing about studying the American power industry is the diversity of institutional forms is astounding. So there's this famous line from Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative to neoliberalism and corporate capitalism. When you look at the power sector, you can say, well, there is an alternative, and it's actually operating at large scale. So we have institutions like municipally owned utilities. Actually, Los Angeles has a municipally owned utility called LADWP. I think at this point, maybe 110, 120 years old. So it's a long-standing local institution. Other big cities have similar munis, as they're called, San Antonio, Seattle, Austin. Then we have rural electric cooperatives that are owned and controlled by their members. At the federal level, we have institutions like the Tennessee Valley Authority that generate and sell power in much of the southeastern United States. And if you look at these public institutions at an aggregate, they serve about 1 in 4 people in the United States. So they're significant. And so this idea that there is no alternative is just contradicted by the facts in front of us. Yeah, there are alternatives. We don't need to have financier dominated institutions where the CEO is being paid $50 million a year and very wealthy people can count on dividend checks of millions of dollars annually. We have systems of genuine public control. And my book looks at how did these institutions come into being? What were the political movements that created them? What were the laws that created them? Not surprisingly, many of these institutions were created during the 1930s and 40s as part of the New Deal. Public power was also a victim of the Red Scare in the 1950s. There was really a push in the 40s to make public power universal, make it the norm, and it was one of the victims of McCarthyism and the conservative backlash of the 50s. But nonetheless, as I said, about 1 in 4 Americans has public or cooperative power today. And my book looks at not just how they came about, but critically assesses them. What's worked well, what hasn't worked so well? Have they actually been embodiments of community control and democracy, or have they been something else? And the truth is, it's been a mixed record. Some institutions have done very well some of the time, and then others have been, practically indistinguishable from investor-owned firms. And my book, in the last part, kind of draws on this history and says, how do we actually make these institutions genuinely democratic? How do we make public power available to everyone, whether they're a poor person of color in Southeast DC or a resident of rural West Virginia that's been victimized by coal mining companies for decades? Like, how do we make public power an effective option for everybody? So my book is a mix of history, critical analysis, and a touch of utopianism. Hence, I'm on this podcast.
That's what's up, and it's so appropriate, and it's also really appropriate because literally another one of our episodes is a conversation with the filmmaker who made a film named King Cole, not Nat King Cole, but Coal, King Cole, which is a film that has just come out and was debuted in Sundance and is an incredible personal poetic reflection from a filmmaker, female filmmaker, multi-generational coal mining West Virginia family about coal's impact on the lives of her community and how coal essentially became deified because in a sense people had no other choice. It was their livelihood, but they also saw and feel its destructive impacts literally on people's lives, black lung disease, and so on. So it's interesting to think about what happens when the rules are manipulated, frankly, through what I believe is corruption, to take a stranglehold of public investments and resources that could or should be public and redeploy them for stock portfolios or massive CEO bonuses, including with companies that were bailed out by the public. So, I actually think that this is a great transition to discuss the internet and digital technology itself. Want to talk about an infrastructure that was originally funded by public taxpayers, right, with the first point of the internet being on my university campus, UCLA, the ARPANET. So, many of you who are listening to this or viewing this may not know that the original architecture that became the internet, a functioning technology where you could share digital information, packets, what were called packets, binary integers across distance, was funded by United States taxpayers. Yet, all these mega so-called internet corporations, you can think about any corporation that uses the internet or lives on the internet, at least in part, or uses our mobile data, etc. Almost none of them pay. Many of them don't pay any taxes, right? Like an Amazon. I see Amazon vehicles often using roads which is also something that we taxpayers paid for. So, I'm really curious how the internet went down this path. Of course, there's a great book on some of these topics by our colleague Tim Wu, who I think is connected to the Federal Trade Commission. Um, how did we get to this point where personal data became hijacked to fuel industries, an internet that taxpayers paid for also fueled all of these industries. Yet many of these industries don't really pay any taxes or provide any of us, whether we're workers. Some of them are in the business of trying to phase out work altogether. I mean, consider the so-called generative AI industry, like OpenAI, ChatGPT, etc. The goal is to cut all costs at all costs, including human costs,
Mm-hmm.
worker costs. Build robotic and automated systems. But all of it is still thriving and needed. All of us, our data, our roads, our investment, or initial investment into the internet. So can we talk? I'm curious how you thought this occurred. I felt like some of it got shrouded by mythologies associated with the so-called digital revolution, which saw it as something that was like Burning Man connected or hippie counterculture style. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area. There's tons of old school hippies like who were seen as sort of internet evangelists, some of who
Right.
eventually got hired by Google. So what happened here? Like, how did Californian utopianism, perhaps even beatnik, certainly anti-capitalist, perhaps at least aesthetically culture, how did it turn into the biggest, most valued companies in the history of the world who are essentially hijacking consumers, stealing our data, in my opinion, trying to get rid of work and workers? How did we get here, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, I think you touched on something really important. I think in the 90s and really the early part of the 2000s, there was this techno-utopianism, techno-determinism that said the internet is just inherently certain things. It's inherently decentralized, it's inherently democratic. And so we don't really need to worry about the rules of the road. Like, how is this market structured? It's just, the internet's a network connecting very, millions of nodes, big and small. Like, that is inherently conducive to democracy and decentralization. And I think that really led people astray. I think people didn't think enough about the policy choices that are necessary to keep a decentralized system that way. And, it was very much aligned with the prevailing neoliberalism of the 90s and the 2000s, which said, generally speaking, we should respect corporate prerogatives. They will do things that are generative of prosperity and broad-based affluence. And the result was, businesses realized, okay, the government's going to take a really light hand on us. If anything, you can look at some of that history and say, well, the government is almost functioning as a cheerleader for these companies in big ways and small ways, subtle and not so subtle ways. And in the 2000s, I think some key decisions were made implicating antitrust and consumer protection law. I think first, this has received a good deal of attention already, firms are allowed to, roll up entire markets. Like, if you look at Google and Facebook, especially, these companies are in substantial measure, the product of acquisitions. Google acquired DoubleClick, YouTube, Android, Motorola for a bit. Like, this company got big by acquiring existing firms. And the antitrust, the so-called trust busters were asleep at the wheel. So I think that was one critical choice. I think the second choice was allowing Google and Facebook in particular to develop and perfect this business of surveillance advertising. One point that I think is often lost in popular and even some academic debates is these companies don't surveil us and collect fine-grained information about us for some voyeuristic reason. Like, they don't really care what you and I are doing on a moment-to-moment basis. What they do care about is developing fairly detailed profiles about who we are. Like, what do we care about? What are we interested in? Whether it's politics or something as pedestrian as what we buy at the grocery store. And they want to be able to use that data and go to advertisers and say, we can target your content much more accurately and precisely than the network news telecast can, or the radio can, or certainly billboards can. And so they're surveilling us to do a better job of advertising. That's kind of the grubby reality of these companies. For all the talk about tech and innovation, they're just trying to do advertising better than NBC or the Washington Post. And that was a choice that was made and at least implicitly ratified by the government early on. And like, the basic arrangement was they would surveil us, but we would get things for free. We'd get search for free. We'd get social networking for free. And on the surface, it seemed like a good deal. We weren't paying anything, and we could find anything that we wanted to on the internet. We could connect with friends and family around the world on Facebook. And now I think there's been a growing realization that, okay, this business model is by no means free. It's premised on systematic surveillance. And the surveillance happens even when we're offline. I mean, I think that was really the big advance represented by smartphones and GPS. These companies know what we're doing even when we're not officially online. They know when we're shopping for gas, when we're going for groceries, when we're visiting our loved ones. And we're at the stage where this business model has just become accepted. And these companies will say, okay, yeah, we are doing these things, but look at the great things you're getting in return. You're getting all these free services. Like, they're not free, for one thing, and they're built on large scale surveillance. So the idea of Facebook respecting our privacy is a contradiction. It's an oxymoron. It's nonsensical. Like, if Facebook respected our privacy, they would either have to close shop or figure out a fundamentally different way of making money tomorrow. But I think we're starting to see some recognition that these business models are pernicious. Like, these companies want us to be online and engaged at all times. There's a reason they care about clickbait. They want us to be online, looking at things, looking at ads, and then also feeding them data. Like, the more time we're online, the more they know about us. I think finally, slowly but surely, we're starting to see like a recognition, not just among scholars and advocates, but among public officials, that, okay, maybe this business model is actually a bad deal. Maybe surveillance advertising is not too good to be true. Maybe there are real social costs. And I think that's one positive result of the debate around polarization, the radicalization of people online. Like, a lot of it is because provocative clickbait content is profitable. These companies have an interest in disseminating, I don't know, Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson, instead of sober scholarly takes on things. So I think that kind of discussion can be used to sort of challenge the basic business model here. I think my concern is people might say, well, what we need Google and Facebook to do is regulate their platforms better. We need better content moderation. We need them to screen certain material. And I think that's going down the wrong path. The solution here isn't to say like certain people will not be allowed to present their views on YouTube. The solution is addressing the business model that makes clickbait so profitable. Back in the 90s, like, far-right people posted things on message boards, but they didn't go viral.
No, because data are aggregated, right, across different streams of life. Almost anything we do, as you said, whether we're offline or online, so to speak, we leave so-called digital footprints, and those forms of data can be aggregated. So maybe I curate my identity in particular ways on Instagram, but that's quite different than what I might buy at the 7-Eleven around the corner, huh? And so ultimately, it's not merely better advertising, it's also the construction of desire and the construction of consumption and the ability to using kind of behaviorist ideas to actually influence people's behaviors. And I think that those are the forms of power though the whole thing could break apart at some point if the entire economy, sort of more as a thought experiment, is one that generates such kind of feudal level inequalities that maybe none of us can afford the junk that advertisers want us to buy. It's not all junk. I get, I'm just, and maybe our data won't be worth that much, but also recognizing that pulling data from me might actually not be about targeting me with stuff only, would also be used to target you with something else, right? Because of correlation and comparison in terms of data profiles, as you were alluding to.
And actually, this ties back to something we were discussing earlier. In the sense we can close the loop about the CFPB. The American economy hasn't delivered sort of sustained positive income gains for most people since the 70s. There's a famous chart produced by EPI that shows the divergence between average labor productivity and average wages. It's a yawning gap. It's gotten larger over time. But the American economy has given us one thing in plenty, and that's credit. So even if we're not experiencing the income gains we like, we still have access to, credit cards, home equity loans, payday loans. So credit is available in plenty. And the reality is, and I saw this in some very dramatic ways working at the CFPB, is credit is no substitute for income. Maybe you and I can get credit on pretty good terms. Like credit is not going to weigh us down, but a lot of the credit out there is actually quite predatory. And obviously, abolishing the predatory credit is a necessary first step, but ultimately, we need an economy where people are experiencing strong wage gains again. Because, as you say, like we need money to buy goods and services. Taking those predatory credit options off the table is good, but we also need to fill that gap. We need to fill that vacuum.
Yeah, massive wage stagnation amidst massive corporate windfalls and valuation and investor and executive paydays.
It all fits together.
It all fits together. And what is the federal minimum wage, Sandeep? Is it still like 8.25 or 7.25?
It's only 7.25, I believe.
Oh, good Lord. So how can anybody in this economy with inflation, not just the near, the inflation of the last few years or so, but in general, the ways prices have gone up and up and up, how can anyone survive, right? And so our president, of course, President Biden, was involved with the credit card industry in
right.
ways, and is no angel when it comes to these issues. But from what I see from afar, and you're in DC, so I think you can tell us a lot more about this. The Federal Trade Commission, which is one organization that that is part, of the federal government, and where he was able to nominate some impressive people to be part of that organization, has been in certain ways going after, trying to use antitrust and other kinds of legal mechanisms to try to stop some of what's going on. I was reading about something with pharmaceutical platforms that a motion was filed by Lena Khan, the Federal Trade Commission chair, if I'm not mistaken. I also hear good things about the National Labor Relations Board, if that's what they're called. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us about some of these levers in DC that are actually part of the federal government, and how you all might be working with them or not? Do we have, are they providing us some hope? And then also whether, so that's the first question. And then the second is it appropriate, given that we have the word Google in the English language, that almost all of us use social media of different types. Amazon is becoming more and more close to a monopoly, if not already. Should these not be regulated like public utilities? What about that possibility?
Sure. So, yeah, it's interesting what's happened under President Biden. So in the Senate, he was very much a corporate Democrat. Famously, he represented Delaware in the Senate. There used to be this big credit card issuer called MBNA. He used to be called a senator from MBNA because he supported laws that made MBNA's life easier as a card issuer.
What's MBNA? Could you just tell us? Yeah.
Oh, MBNA was just a large credit card issuer. I think it was bought by Bank of America in the early 2000s, but they used to be a big player in the credit card industry. They were based in Delaware. And Joe Biden was seen as serving them very loyally and ably. But as president, he's made made some breaks with Senator Biden. I think he's been more progressive than people expected. I think some of it is changed political circumstances. I think there is much more energy and activism on the left than there was for a long time. I think he's feeling real pressure from his left. And so you see that in some of his appointments. You mentioned the Federal Trade Commission, the National Labor Relations Board. The people he appointed were surprisingly progressive, more progressive than uh, their counterparts during the Obama administration. And I think when people think about policymaking and law in DC, they think about Congress passing laws. And obviously, in the best of all possible worlds, Congress would be doing a lot more. But the good thing is, all these agencies, executive agencies, administrative agencies, have a lot of existing statutory authority that they were given over the years. Congress delegated a lot of policymaking functions to these agencies. And so an agency like the NLRB or the FTC can do a lot without any new law from Congress. And we're starting to see some of that. I think that NLRB is maybe the single most exciting place right now. They're reviving older pro-worker labor doctrines, making it easier for workers to organize. I think there's a reason we're seeing a wave of union drives, wave of strike activity in that right now, and I think NLRB deserves some credit for that. Similarly, on the antitrust side, we've seen some big lawsuits filed against the tech companies. So the FTC just filed a major lawsuit against Amazon. The sister agency, the Department of Justice, filed suits against Google. And I think these suits, these policy initiatives could, over time, restructure these markets. Nothing's going to happen quickly. We shouldn't expect any changes overnight, maybe not even in the next year or two. It might take 5 or 10 years. But I'll talk about the Amazon suit specifically, just to make things a little bit more concrete for your listeners. So, yeah, I'm losing track of time. I think it was just last week. The FTC brought a big antitrust case against Amazon.
It was last week, yeah.
Last Tuesday, I believe. And the suit's been in the works for a while. The FTC has been investigating Amazon for years. And the FTC alleged that what Amazon is doing is really two things. Raising prices for consumers, contrary to what Amazon says about itself and how it markets itself. Amazon touts its convenience, its low prices, but the FTC alleged actually Amazon's engaged in some practices that are raising prices across the digital retail economy, and then also coercing its sellers. So Amazon has about 3 million online sellers in the United States. So these are small businesses that use Amazon as a platform, much like how sellers use eBay for a platform. But unlike eBay, Amazon exercises pretty tight control over its sellers. And what the FTC alleges is, if you're a seller on Amazon, Amazon tells you you will not sell your goods for less on eBay or on your own platform, even though Amazon's actually extracting a very significant tax from these sellers right now. Analysis done by Bloomberg found that if you're selling goods on Amazon, about 50 cents on every dollar goes to Amazon in the form of fees and commissions. So Amazon's extracting a good deal of money from its sellers and also telling them you cannot charge less on eBay, even if eBay might only take 10 or 15 cents on the dollar, or sell for less on your own platform. So sellers recognize they're dependent on Amazon. If they want to reach tens of millions of people, they have to be on Amazon. And Amazon's exploiting that dependency to say, don't you dare charge less elsewhere. You are dependent on us, and we're exercising the dominance over you to prevent discounting elsewhere. So I think the FTC has filed a very smart suit where it can credibly claim that it's standing up for consumers and then also sellers. Because one sort of pushback against the work my colleagues and I have been doing is we supposedly want to make life harder for consumers. We want to raise prices for consumers. And the FTC suit has said, no, actually, the party that's raising consumer prices is Amazon. We might actually have cheaper goods if Amazon didn't use these contractual restraints.
It's a great example of the intelligent use of levers. of regulation and law to try to rein in some of this. And then what about the public utility kind of idea, right? Like Google's a word in the English alphabet.
Right.
It's 98, 99% of searches are done on Google. Of course, Bing is interfacing, I think, with this Chat GPT. So that might erode some of that. But shouldn't so when we say public utility, we mean that a utility should not discriminate, right?
Right.
So what is kind of public utility approach toward reining this in? What does that look like? What are the kind of the values of a public utility mode of regulation?
Sure. So as a preliminary matter, I think I would resist the sort of sharp contrast between public utility regulation and antitrust. I think historically they were often discussed together, and there's clearly overlap between the two areas. But I think public utility regulation can be especially valuable when we have services that we think of as essential or possessing natural monopoly characteristics. Like we all need to do business with Google. We all use Google to search. Uh, when we're talking about necessities, when we're talking about national monopoly, I think it makes sense to talk in the language of public utility regulation, which, as you described, traditionally meant non-discrimination, openness to all comers, uh, transparent terms of service. And so what would that look like in the digital space? I think there's a lot of work to be done here because it's a nice principle, but it's not entirely clear how it would apply to something like Google. But at a bare minimum, I think Google as a public utility would mean something like Google cannot favor its own affiliates in search results. So if you search for, flights to Paris, Google under a public utility regime would not be able to put Google travel results at the very top and marginalize, I don't know, Kayak or Priceline or American Airlines. So that would be a starting point for public utility regulation. But I think it would also mean a lot more. It would probably mean prohibitions on special deals. So, Priceline wouldn't be able to approach Google and say, hey, we'll give you a sum of money every year if we get greater visibility in search results for anything pertaining to travel. So it would mean like a strong non-discrimination system. And then, turning to Amazon, you can imagine a public utility system saying, Amazon cannot suspend third-party sellers without providing them advance notice and providing them cause. Because right now, Amazon can delist or degrade a seller in search results for any reason or no reason at all. The sellers have complained about this. I recommend this great report by Moira Weigel, who was also at the Penn conference with us, where she did an ethnography of Amazon sellers, and many of them complained that they were being disappeared effectively for no reason. They were trying to figure out, like, why did Amazon disappear us in search results? And if you had a real system of public utility rules, Amazon would not be able to do that without giving it a minimum advance notice and an explanation like, okay, you violated this term of service. This is why you're no longer showing up in search results. So it'd be a check on that arbitrary power that exists right now.
Yeah, and it's a great and these are great examples, Uber, Amazon, some of the other things we've discussed, Google itself, of how what we call platformization, right? What we mean by that is a place you go to that appears to be the open universe, the open market. I mean, everybody remember, for some of you or listeners from around the world or have traveled around the world, we've been in markets that are like bazaars, which are like open air places with vendors of all types, many of whom know one another. And there's not some sort of hidden, invisible architecture that's sort of forcing you to buy or see certain things and not others, or making decisions around who goes invisible, who doesn't even exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
and what's notable about those public markets is they're often publicly owned or regulated. So you have a municipal government constructing a market square and saying, sellers can come here every Saturday and Sunday and sell their wares. Or even if it's not publicly owned, it's publicly regulated, basically open to all comers, can't discriminate in terms of service. And you're right, these companies try to present themselves as the 21st century digital equivalent, but they're not in some critical ways. They're the ones setting the rules.
That's right. Some other episodes of this podcast of Utopias are interviews with entrepreneurs in grassroots African markets in other parts of the world. And they often tell me that, they have to adhere to certain rules enforced by the city or the municipality, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the terms that's used for this kind of, fake market feeling that we all get when we go online is called persuasion architecture. Um, and that can actually be applied to, any of us who go into an IKEA that have to walk through the entire kind of IKEA past all sorts of other things before we get to whatever we want to buy, or the National Enquirer and the bubble gum and so on that you get right when you check out at 7-Eleven or at the supermarket. But in this case, it's all invisible and it's all algorithmically
Right.
constructed. It's an invisible architecture. All right, so now kind of to the utopian end um, of today's conversation, and this is just the beginning, of course, because I'm learning so much from you, and I hope all of us are having a chance to really benefit from your brilliance, actually, Sandeep.
You're too
which
kind.
which is really like a planetary question that I have, and kind of a question of what all of us as some combination of workers, consumers, most importantly, living human beings. So this is kind of a two-part question, like most of my questions. So one is sort of, as people around the planet, how should we approach these issues? How should we approach our engagements with this kind of zombification, corporate consolidation, platformization, the digital versions, the issues that we've discussed? That's sort of one question. And the other
Mm-hmm.
is, of course, our focus has been primarily on the United States, because many of these corporations we're discussing start in the US but have massive impacts around the planet. But
Right.
when we look to other nations or communities or organizations that are in other parts of the world, from South America to South Asia to Africa to Europe, etc., are there other sorts of examples out there that give us a sense of hope that that our world won't just be dominated by surveillance obsessed, oligopolic or monopolistic corporations?
Yeah, I think starting with your first question, I think neoliberalism has been extraordinarily successful at persuading people that politics, public action is an exercise in futility. We discussed there is no alternative earlier. I think it's been extraordinarily successful at propagating that idea that things are the way they are because there's no other way to organize society. United States globe might be very unequal, but that's just how things are. In a sense, like naturalizing what are fundamentally human institutions and human decision making. So I think an essential sort of threshold step is recognizing that none of this is natural. Some people in very powerful places made decisions, and in the past, those decisions were made differently, and in part because of mass action, organizing and advocacy and fighting. The New Deal didn't happen because President Franklin Roosevelt was this enlightened aristocrat. I think he was personally comparatively progressive, but he was also under tremendous pressure from the left to do more. And I think rejecting the idea of inevitability, rejecting the idea that any of this is natural, is the first step. But then I think the second step is kind of valuing and appreciating democracy again, and recognizing that these things can be changed, but it's going to take collective action. We can feel good about ourselves by not shopping here or not shopping there, but individual action is I would say an exercise in futility. But I think we're seeing right now with the UAW strike, Kaiser Permanente workers went on strike. There is power in numbers. The other side has ungodly sums of money, but we have people, and acting in concert, we can actually be extraordinarily disruptive and inflict pain on people who seem impervious to pain. As your second question, all these trends have been global in nature, so it's hard to point to places that have sort of bucked this trend and pursued a different path. In the mid 20th century, there were the Western liberal democracies, and then there was the Eastern Bloc. There was like an alternative being done at scale, obviously a very flawed alternative, but it existed. In recent times, that hasn't been the case. You can point to differences in degrees. France is more social democratic than the US. Canada is maybe somewhere between France and the US. And looking elsewhere, looking at India or China, it's not necessarily that inspiring or appealing. I mean, I think the one part of the world that has bucked this trend at points in the past 20 years has been Latin America. So there has been a vibrant left of various shades. But you could look at Brazil under Lula and say, okay, they are doing things differently in some important ways. Same with maybe Ecuador under Correa. So Latin America is the one part of the world where you see different models being pursued and done quite successfully.
Yeah, and we see social movements there that have changed power in Latin America. For example, in Colombia, where I was just a few months ago with the election of Gustavo Petro, who's sort of a
Right.
Bernie Sanders type character. In Chile, wow, we're I don't know, 40-year-old leader of the student
Yeah, maybe not even
movement.
40.
Is he not even 40? Dear
Yeah, he
Lord.
might be in his 30s, but I'm not sure. He's a
Wow.
young guy either way.
Yeah, I mean, who they're attempting to rewrite the constitution. We see it in Ecuador, where the constitution actually guarantees, despite a recent right-wing takeover after the time of Correa, where the constitution actually guarantees the rights of non-humans, of nature,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore uses those sorts of statutes to support indigenous land protectors who are trying to stave off fossil fuel companies and the paramilitary gangsters that they often employ and deploy to kill indigenous peoples and journalists. So these are things you see in Latin America. So I think it's important. It's a great example of how our world is very globalized in a highly asymmetric way, right? In this,
Right.
and how the mirage or the veil of free and open choice is afforded to us by these corporate privatized platforms and architectures. But in reality, we might have something more Truman Show like, for all of you who know that old reference. Great movie. And I think I also just want to say, and I want your 2 cents on this, that when we say progressive or left, at least in my case, what I mean are a set of values that are in line with the demos having power, meaning the people
Right.
having power, and doesn't matter. It's not a question of race per se or gender per se. It's the demos. It's all of us together, whether we're
Absolutely.
workers, whether we're consumers, whether we're male, we're female, we're queer, we're no, this, that, or the other. It's about all of us. It's about recognizing that we actually live in a deeply interconnected planet. Obviously ecologically and in terms of pandemics, as we've all seeing, but also economically and politically. So progressive to me means that it's about everybody having power. And so, but without the scapegoat that never works of blaming immigrants or women or whatever it
Mm-hmm.
is, this kind of the hate associated with it. So I think, this conversation has given me actually a lot of hope. I am a very kind of hopeful, optimistic person, because otherwise, what do we do? But we also now see right in front of us what the playbook looks like in terms of the challenges and the opportunities. I just wanted to give you any final thoughts, any final comments you'd like to make, and also how can all of us keep up with you, your organization, the Open Markets Institute, but in general, and all of your work and your role also as a publicly engaged scholar, activist, professional, etc.
Yeah, so my organization and I are fairly active on Twitter for all its flaws. It's still maybe the best way to participate in these conversations and reach people. So I encourage you to follow us on there. Yeah, I think I'll also end on an optimistic note. I think the challenges are real. Oligarchy and climate change are kind of the top two for me. Uh, both are really climate change, certainly global in nature, but even oligarchy, very much global in nature. And it's a long fight ahead. And I realize, especially with climate change, we don't have the luxury of decades or centuries, but I see some encouraging signs. I think there are ideas being discussed now that were unimaginable 15 years ago. Even within corridors of power, you're hearing things that you couldn't have imagined, past Democratic president talking about. So you're seeing, for all its flaws, the federal government committing in a significant way to decarbonization, and I certainly hope it's not the last word, but rather maybe a prelude to something like a Green New Deal. So I don't agree with those people who say that neoliberalism is dead, that Biden is the post-neoliberal president. I think that's false, but it could be an inflection point where new paths open up and we confidently and aggressively go down those paths in this decade.
Thank you so much for joining us again. So everybody, please follow the Open Markets Institute and Sandeep Vaheesan, and we'll of course put links up to how you can do that when with the release of this podcast, both in audio and or video form. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Ramesh.